Greetings and salutations and welcome to Colin's Last Stand, the independent, fan-supported show dedicated to our shared love of politics, history, knowledge, and free thought. Thank you for being here with me. I hope you're well. Today I want to talk about California Exit, also known as CalExit, which is a fresh, ongoing attempt to split California off from the United States. Not into 6 separate states as a recent failed proposal attempted to do, but into a separate country. That's right, secession! The very issue that caused the bloodiest war in American history and set the southern states' economies and cultures back generations. Now, when I decided to do an episode about CalExit, I didn't have in my possession a whole lot of facts. And from what I did know, I actually felt somewhat neutral on the issue. I could see some benefits for California if it split off from the rest of the country, and I could also see plentiful benefits for the rest of the United States, especially for conservatives, since California's exit could essentially mean a permanent conservative majority at the federal level. Naturally, problems would also erupt for both sides, with money and trade and the overwhelming burden California would be under simply to create a new governing apparatus. And so I began my research in earnest. There's so much to cover here that this will be 2 videos, not 1. My research almost immediately brought me to the official website for CalExit, yescalifornia.org, and its bullet-pointed catch-all list called The Case for Independence in 9 simple points. That's a perfect way to describe these points, simple. Because with all due respect, these 9 simple points read like the crazed musings of a teenager who just read Noam Chomsky for the first time. These points, as it turns out, represent the intellectual backing of California's exit plan. 9 points so easy to dismantle with basic facts and logic that it quickly became clear to me that not only isn't there an iceberg's chance in hell of California ever leaving the Union, but that the very premise of why it should is, for lack of a better term, laughable. The entire thing is predicated on one notion: overt, out-of-control selfishness. For all of the videos I saw on YouTube and editorials I read elsewhere on the internet extolling how much of a positive this would be for California and Californians, and how the rest of the United States would essentially be held hostage if this happened, all I can think of now is how none of the arguments made to support California's countryhood make any sense. But before I get into all of that, I feel like just a little background on secession in the United States is necessary. The Confederate States of America represent the only truly notable secession movement in American history, and for a brief time it was actually successful. South Carolina left in December of 1860. By April of 1861, the Confederacy was 11 states strong. By 1865, nearly 300,000 Southerners had died in the conflict, the South was in complete ruins, and it took generations for the region to recover from its secessionist plot, bringing a whole lot of collateral damage along with it, most notably to post-Reconstruction African Americans. But there were other, less notable secession movements too. When the United States found itself embroiled in the War of 1812 with the British Empire, the New England states, led by the Federalist Party, convened a meeting in Connecticut to discuss forming a new country. Although, as pointed out by ConnecticutHistory.org, timing was all off. The meeting was held in late 1814, and the war ended right around there as well. Texas has long been a hotbed of secession talk, raging to this day, while even Vermont has a secession movement of little notoriety. In modern times, other than CalExit, the Cascadia movement is probably the one most recognizable, an attempt to basically lop off the Pacific Northwest and make its own country. Depending on who you ask, this hypothetical country could range from Alaska through British Columbia into Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and California. It'll never happen, of course, but it's fun food for thought. So now that we have a little structure, let's get back to CalExit. The organizers of the movement want to get the ballot launched statewide in 2 waves. USA Today notes that if it can collect nearly 600,000 valid signatures, Californians will first vote in 2018 to amend the state constitution so that it no longer contains the line, quote, an inseparable part of the United States, end quote. The movement also needs the statement in the California Constitution noting the US Constitution as the supreme law of the land stricken. If that happens, then in 2019, California can vote for secession itself, sending the issue to the federal Congress. If it sounds pie in the sky, that's because it is. Polling in early January of 2017 shows that CalExit doesn't have anywhere near the support it would need to pass. 32% supported the movement at that time. And it's highly unlikely at the end of the day that California would be able to separate without a violent conflict. Scary to think about, but abject reality nonetheless. But let's get back to those 9 simple points I mentioned earlier. I want to go through the first 4 for now, we don't have all day after all, and present my arguments as to why this entire idea is flimsy, The first of the 9 points is called Peace and Security, and here's what it says. Quote, the US government spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. Not only is California forced to subsidize the massive military budget with our taxes, but Californians are sent off to fight in wars that often do more to perpetuate terrorism than to abate it. The only reason terrorists might want to attack us is because we are part of the United States and are guilty by association. Not being a part of the country will make California a less likely target of retaliation by its enemies. End quote. This is a truly bizarre argument on its own, and an even stranger one to open with, mostly because you could replace the word California with the name of any other US state, and the statement would hold equal weight and be literally as accurate or inaccurate as it originally was. Seriously, let me show you. Let's replace California with, say, North Dakota. Now the statement reads, quote, the US government spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. Not only is North Dakota forced to subsidize this massive military budget with our taxes, but North Dakotans are sent off to fight in wars that often do more to perpetuate terrorism than to abate it. The only reason terrorists might want to attack us is because we are part of the United States and are guilty by association. Not being a part of that country will make North Dakota a less likely target of retaliation by its enemies. End quote. This statement is essentially making the case for the complete dissolution of the United States. We're all supposed to be in this together, striving towards a common goal for the common good. This was a principle the founders held to, which is why they, well, joined or died. And during the time of the Confederate Secession, Abraham Lincoln and his team did some calculations and arrived at the same result. The long and the short of it is, this statement reeks of selfishness, which, as you're going to find out, is a common theme. Complete and utter selfishness, as if California is California because of itself, and not because of its association with the world's greatest economic, military, and cultural power. It's the utter height of delusion. Yes, it's true that the United States spends a gratuitous amount of money on its military. In fact, a full third of all military spending in the world is American, when America has less than 5% of the global population. But that's something we all pay for, not just Californians. I'm going to save the taxation breakdown that CalExit supporters like to swing around for a little later, but I just want to reiterate in the meantime that this is a bizarre way to begin making your case, especially because the federal government injects more than $50 billion a year into California in defense contracts and personnel spending alone, including $23.3 billion a year to San Diego, a lovely city which hosts tens of thousands of uniformed men and women and a significant portion of the American naval fleet. Without military spending in California, San Diego's economy would crumble underneath its own weight, which isn't a secret to anyone. Oh, and as for terrorism? 2015's tragic San Bernardino shooting is the only major terrorist attack to happen in California since the modern war on terror effectively began following the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. 14 people died in that act of terror. Nearly 24 more experienced injuries, some catastrophic. Not to diminish the act of terror, but New York lost thousands in a single day due to terrorism. I lived there at the time. I don't recall anyone talking about how we New Yorkers were being targeted because of the United States foreign policy, and that maybe we should secede so as to avoid future ramifications. What a bonkers argument. It's laughable. The second of the 9 simple points is called Elections and Government, and it reads like this, quote, California's electoral votes haven't affected a presidential election since 1876. On top of that, presidential election results are often known before our votes are even counted. So why should we keep subjecting ourselves to presidents we play no role in electing, to 382 representatives and 98 senators we can't vote for, and all of the government officials and federal judges appointed by those very same people we don't elect, end quote. I read this 100 times and I still haven't one single clue what any of it actually means. To begin, the 1876 election was between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote, but lost the election, similar to the Clinton-Trump situation. California's 6 electoral votes at the time contributed to Hayes' 1-point win, but by that argument, 20 other states that also voted for Hayes could have been the deciding factor. What is the argument here exactly? Did California's 8 electoral votes not contribute to Benjamin Harrison's win in 1888? Or to Grover Cleveland's win in 1892? Or to William McKinley's win in 1896? I could go on and on and on here, but I'll spare you. This particular argument is nonsense, which is shocking since the rest of the arguments have been really strong so far. Now that we know that California has played a role in electing many presidents since 1876, we can now focus on the rest of the statement, which asks why California should keep subjecting itself to, quote, 382 representatives and 98 senators we can't vote for, end quote. I think the simplest explanation for this is because when California joined the United States in 1850, both parties agreed to the system as is. It's pretty straightforward, really. California's representatives and Congress both agreed to the terms. The vote was binding. A statement like this isn't only profoundly selfish, but it acts as if other states don't also have disproportionate yet structurally balanced representation. Wyoming gets the same 2 senators, but only a single House member. Meanwhile, California's population ensures it has 52 representatives, 52 times more than Wyoming's. Sounds pretty balanced and fair if you ask me. Newsflash to California, you're not the only state with a massive population that puts you at a disadvantage in the Senate. New York, Florida, and Texas say hello. Third on the list of 9 items is called Trade and Regulation, and it reads as follows, quote, "The U.S. government maintains a burdensome trade system that hurts California's economy by making trade more difficult and more expensive for California's businesses. As long as California remains within this burdensome trade system, we will never be able to capitalize on the trade and investment opportunities that would be available to us as an independent country," end quote. Again, I'm not entirely sure what this even means, but let's attempt to work through it. I'm not quite positive what the government does to California in particular that it doesn't also do to the rest of the country when it comes to trade. The federal government controls, dictates, and allows interstate commerce by way of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This section of the Constitution doesn't call out California, which didn't even exist at the time it was written, nor does it single out any other state. Since states are treated in an egalitarian way by the federal government, it's again fair to say that whatever onerous issues befall California's trade economy also injure the other 49 states. Let's be clear, California's economy is an absolute powerhouse. It's true that if it were an independent country, it would have the 6th largest economy in the world. But what does that really have to do with anything? There are nearly 40 million people in California. A $2.2 trillion GDP for the state in 2013 is nothing to sneeze at. But it's not nearly as impressive as the United States' $16.8 trillion GDP overall. California's economy remains dominated by agriculture. It leads the US in both fruit and vegetable production, not to mention wine. But much of those products are sold in the other 49 states that California apparently doesn't need anymore. Oh, and the water that keeps all of those crops growing, even in times of severe drought like what the state has recently been going through, that water comes from the Colorado River. Do you think that California-less American government is going to let that water just continue to flow? As for those onerous regulations, again, the entire country suffers from them. California does a bang-up job of making it worse on its own people, though. While many states are known for their pro-business stance, Texas comes to mind. California, according to Wayne Weingarten at Pacific Research Institute, notes that when compared to all the other states on 14 different so-called regulatory components in regards to small business growth in particular, California comes in dead last. 50 laboratories of economic experimentation, with California on the ass end. I owned a small business in California, and I can attest to the hoops you have to jump through and the hurdles you have to overcome just to make ends meet. It's not just a talking point. California simply isn't business friendly at all. The fourth of the 9 points, and the last one we'll discuss in this video, is a real doozy: debt and taxes. Here's what it says. Quote, "Since 1987, California has been subsidizing the other states at a loss of tens and sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars in a single fiscal year. As a result, we are often forced to raise taxes and charge fees in California, and borrow money from the future to make up the difference. This is partly why California presently has some of the highest taxes in the country, and so much debt. Independence means that all of our taxes will be kept in California based on the priorities we set, and we will be able to do so while repaying our debts and phasing out the current state income tax," end quote. I'll give it to them here. That last sentence sounds amazing. Other states have already eliminated the state income tax, including Washington and Texas, but in California, the state income tax can go as high as 13.3%. That's not federal tax, that's state tax. But that's for people making over $500,000 a year. Let's assume you make, say, $64,500 a year in California, which is the median household income in the state. Your marginal tax rate is 9.3%. That's the federal government's fault, apparently, if you believe the Cal Exit movement. Texas seems to be doing just fine with a massive population, no income tax, and few complaints, but that's neither here nor there. Their argument is basically this: Californians offset the rest of the country's tax shortfall. This is true in the most minor sense, but it doesn't paint a complete picture. For starters, while PolitiFact confirms that California is what's called a donor state, that is to say, a state whose people pay more to the federal government than get back in services, grants, and the like, it's almost a wash. For every dollar a Californian gives to the federal government, it gets 99 cents back. To California's credit, the national average is getting $1.22 back for every dollar sent to the capital, but California isn't the only state that suffers here. The 78 cents per dollar spent argument that's thrown around so often goes back to the mid-2000s and uses faulty reasoning to arrive at that number. In other words, it's not nearly as dire as it seems, especially considering the 99 cent per dollar spent figure comes from none other than the California Legislative Analyst's Office, basically blowing the whole premise to smithereens. Since this very fact destroys the entire notion that California is paying the federal government so much money that it needs to raise its own taxes, let's focus on those raised taxes that we can now say ostensibly exist to feed the Californian beast, not the federal government. Next 10 notes that California's state income tax is the highest in the country, with an unusually high sales tax and a staggeringly high corporate tax to boot, offset only by its unusually paltry property taxes. The Tax Foundation confirms that state and local governments tax Californians to such a significant degree that people in the state are the 6th most taxed outside of federal taxation in the country. The gasoline tax here, as an example, ranks 7th in the country, but blame the federal government if you must. Forbes, on the other hand, notes that there's an exodus of wealthy people leaving California because of onerous state taxation. Meanwhile, the state literally just voted in the fall of 2016 to raise its own taxes. Alrighty then. California's debt is indeed significant. Combined local and state debt in California amounts to $1.3 trillion and counting, accounting for more than half of the state's annual GDP. Just imagine how much more crushing that debt will become if California seceded peacefully and the United States asked for the state portion of the federal debt. How much is that, you ask? Oh, it's nothing major, just another $2.4 trillion or so, bringing the state's debt to a staggering $3.7 trillion. Forbes points out that California's debt is about to get way worse too, as it has a statewide unfunded pension liability of $300 billion, which it would have to deal with without federal help. Throw that number on the debt while you're at it. There's so much more to say, but I'm going to cut it off here for now. The 5 other points on the CalExit platform include immigration, natural resources, the environment, health and medicine, and education. In the coming weeks, I'll go into those 5 points, as well as draw some final conclusions on this farcical movement. Then we can mash that video together with this one and have one long-winded diatribe about why this movement is so incredibly dumb. In the meantime, know this: California isn't going anywhere. The entire premise behind the secession movement is nothing but a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment, glued together only with vapid notions and ideas. The data presented here and the points I made merely scratch the surface of this foolishness. While you're waiting for the next video, feel free to check out the bibliography and reading list in the description. Until we meet again for another episode of Colin's Last Stand, please keep the feedback coming, be good to each other in the comments, and above all else, keep on learning.